It's my pleasure to welcome everybody to the Free Market Foundation. It's a good turnout, I have to say. I thought everyone already knew about unemployment, so I didn't expect this turnout. But let me start off by saying Eustace's two great passions in the world that we know of, the others that he keeps a secret and has done for many years, are unemployment and education. And unlike most people, I don't think he thinks education is the solution to unemployment, which is a common refrain one hears. I think he would probably say, but he'll correct me if I'm wrong, that the two are two separate important things, but not connected, not one causal to the other. Eustace used to be a chartered accountant. I'm not sure what an unchartered accountant is, but apparently he was chartered. And he before joining the FMF, he was a business person, entrepreneur. Unlike me, I preach capitalism, but I'm a terrible capitalist. I have no idea what I earn. Literally, for example, bank says, "What is my income?" I said, "I have to ask my wife." And she says to me, "None," because she doesn't give me any of it. So Eustace was in business. He practiced as an accountant and auditor in Harrismith and Bethlehem in the Free State. He became a shareholder and hands-on participant in the supermarket business and established new supermarkets in Vryheid and Ladysmith, in Natal then, as it was, KZN. And once the supermarket chain had expanded, he returned to accounting and auditing and was an investor in a motel, filling station and liquor store. And that's when I met him, when he was in those businesses, in Harrismith in particular. He left accounting and auditing to join the Free Market Foundation, and that itself was an interesting story, how he became aware of us, and we met in the very embryonic years of the foundation before there was a permanent structure of any sort. We just said there was one, and people believed us. And his purpose was, as he puts in his notes to me, to save South Africa from apartheid and socialism. I'm not sure what the "and" does there. Apartheid is and was socialism, so it should be to save South Africa from apartheid socialism. And just on that, I won't say much more, but the eminent British economist Roy Harrod said after he'd visited South Africa and Soweto, he said, "South Africa is the world's most perfect accomplishment of socialism ever. Nowhere else has class been effectively eliminated and state ownership and control been as effectively created as in black townships in South Africa. And the only reason South Africa could have perfect communism and perfect socialism was because it had this little 10% of the population living under capitalism to produce the wealth." And I think that is correct. Apartheid was socialism. I'm sure Eustace would agree. And Eustace is now going to address us on his number one passion. We never have a meeting in the Free Market Foundation. We can be talking about whether we should be recycling tea bags. And Eustace will say it depends on unemployment. 10 million people are unemployed. And so he will... I'm looking forward to hearing him. He's very knowledgeable about the issue, very passionate about the issue, and very distressed about the fraud and the hoax that gets perpetrated by having, I call it the Department Against Labour, other people call it the Labour Department, and to have what we call a labour policy is a very silly thing. We have an anti-labour policy, a policy that says whatever you do, don't create jobs. Do something else, use machines or go abroad, whatever. But whatever you do, make it as maximally unattractive to employ people as possible. And Eustace is our constant conscience on behalf of the unemployed and will address us on the subject which distresses him terribly. So I have a box of tissues at hand if he breaks down, as he might well do. Eustace, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Neil. Not distressed, enraged. That's a different condition altogether. And that's where the the title comes from. People might think it's a bit over the top, but it is not. I use the word brutal because unemployment at the rate it is today is totally unnecessary. It should not be like that. The only reason why it has happened, why almost 40% of the potential workforce in South Africa is without jobs, is because it's been made so by legislation and regulation. It might sound to you like being a bit far-fetched, but it is true. It's no mystery why it is so, as I've said. Regulation of, everything, regulation of the businesses. The focus is on employers. And that's why people generally don't know why there is such a high unemployment rate. Because the employers, they have to go through a whole rigmarole in dealing with their employees. And nobody says, but those unemployed people, why don't they just go out and work? And the reason is the employers can't employ them without landing in trouble themselves. The barriers to entry into the labour market are all these laws and regulations. So you see a sign outside a factory gate saying, no jobs. Why no jobs? Because the problem with this unemployment is that the people who can't get jobs are not the ones that are going to be employed by big business. Large businesses have human resources departments who go to a lot of trouble to decide who is going to get a job in that organization. The small business, what do? Usually they would want to try somebody out, see if they can get on with them to start with, if they can work properly. They can't do that because once they take them on, they're stuck with them. The unemployed are generally ignored. They're ignored by the government, and sadly, to a large extent, the opposition parties haven't been putting enough into the question of defending the rights of the unemployed. So the burden is on the employers, and they have their own way of dealing with it. What it does do for those people who are employed is to give them a high level of job security. Yeah, good, that's great for them. But giving them this high level of job security at the same time establishes the barriers to entry for the unemployed. These are the figures as at the end of June. Can you believe it? 10.226 million unemployed people. Last year, 2018, it was 9.8 or something like that. And my colleague Temba Nolachunga and I gave evidence before 2 parliamentary committees on the question of the national minimum wage. And we said to them, you are going to cause further unemployment. Are you not ashamed of yourselves? They looked a bit uncomfortable, but they went ahead and did it anyway. And just look at it. 2.517 million, 15 to 24 years old, 68.3 of the potential people of that age who could get jobs. Then 25 to 34 years old, 3.933 million, 42.5%. If you add the two together, it's just over 50% of those young people. 6.4 million of them are unemployed. Young people and nobody can give them jobs. The people who, the homeowners, the small businesses don't dare take them on. Talk to them and they say, but why can't I get a job and the foreigners can? There's a very good reason for it. The foreigners, you can hire them today, and I thought you could fire them tomorrow, but I've now found out that even they can go to the CCMA, even if they're illegal foreigners. This shows you, how well they're looking after the people who belong to maybe labour unions. 4 million discouraged work seekers. Now these are people who have not applied for a job within 1 month of the study being done. Now, if you've been unemployed for a year, are you going to go along every month to go and try and find a job or be recorded as having looked for a job? No, you're not. You give up in despair. Look at them. They don't look cheerful, do they? They have a right to look despondent. And it's not compassionate to create legislation and enforce regulations that shut more than 10 million job seekers out of the job market. It is horrendous. Now these people, if you look at the Constitution and you look at the various sections in the Constitution that should be protecting them from being unemployed. Section 7.2 requires the state to respect, protect, promote and fulfill the rights in the Bill of Rights. 9.1, everyone is equal before the law, supposedly, and has the right to equal protection and benefit of the law. 9.3, the state may not discriminate directly or indirectly against anyone on one or more grounds. The unemployed are being discriminated against because the level of protection for those who have jobs keeps on increasing, the latest being the national minimum wage. Everyone has inherent dignity and the right to have their dignity respected and protected. How dignified do you think 10 million unemployed people feel about not having jobs? What is it like to be in their communities? Every citizen has the right to choose their occupation freely. You could have fooled me, not freely. Everyone has the right to fair labour practices. Totally unfair. Just think about it. When they were considering the national minimum wage, NEDLAC had the job of deciding whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. And do you think the unemployed had a say? Were they invited, some of the 10 million, to come and give evidence before NEDLAC? Not at all. Who was there? The labour unions, government, and somebody else, but not the unemployed. As far as a job is concerned, if you're unemployed and you're looking for a job, who should have the final say as to what wage you will accept? under what conditions you're prepared to work, and to agree on the terms of your employment. Should it not be the unemployed person? Has anyone else got the right to say, no, under 3,500 Rand, you are not allowed to work. Stay unemployed. You are not allowed to say, give me a chance. If you're not happy with me, you just have to tell me and I'll go. Even if it's on the second day. Sorry, can't do it. The mean-wellers. These are people who have, some of them really do mean well, but they do an enormous amount of harm. So who should have the final say? I think you'll agree with me. It should be the unemployed person. The losses and opportunities suffered by the unemployed are enormous. Just look at this. If the unemployed were earning 1,000 Rand per month each, the earnings would total 122.712 billion in a year. Multiply that by 2 or 3, with them earning slightly higher. And I've already mentioned those who are less skilled youth, aged between 15 and 34. And the poor education Leon mentioned. Yes, of course it has an influence. If you can read and write and calculate, it does help. But it's not the real reason. The real reason is the barriers to entry into the job market. Now, focus on single earner households. People are inclined to do that and say, well, what does it help? With one person earning 1,000 Rand a month or 2,000 Rand a month. But if you have 4 people in the family and it goes to 6,000 and 8,000 Rand, then it does make a difference. It certainly makes a difference to their lives. And it makes a difference if they are in the position to accept work on those conditions. So family of 5, 4,000. And the most important part is once they have a foot in the door, then things will change for them. If they work hard and they learn skills, their lives will change. Whilst they're blocked from entry into the market and they can't do anything, what are they supposed to do? Awukho umsebenzi. No jobs. And as the legal protections and benefits grow for those who have jobs, so the barriers to entry grow that keep the unemployed out. For instance, the national minimum wage. We told the people in Parliament, we said to them, please, you must realize that the wages in the cities and towns much higher than out in the rural areas. You cannot have a wage across the board, a minimum wage across the board, because you are going to put people out of jobs in the places where they are most needed, out in the rural areas. One of the group of mean-wellers at Wits University, they said that they had looked around the world and they could find no real evidence that minimum wages cause job losses. Now, when they look around the world, who are they looking at? Here we've got almost 40% unemployment rate. The USA is slightly less than 4%, and so is Canada, and so is the UK, Is that what they were looking at? Were they looking at their economies to find out whether jobs get lost? But even then, just lately, in New York, amongst the restaurants, there's been 500 job losses. And these are young people. These are the ones who work for pocket money or to help with their universities' fees and all that kind of thing. So even there's damage done. But as we said to the MPs in Parliament, we said to them, have a look at Puerto Rico and the other US dependencies. And they were told that they must bring their minimum wage level with that of the United States mainland. In the one island, the job losses were 30% of the workforce in a period of 2 years, and 50% in the tuna industry. Massive job losses forced on them by the US government. Absolutely insane. And it is a level of insanity to introduce a national minimum wage in South Africa and put more people out of work. The numbers have increased since it was introduced on the 1st of January. And the complicity of the meanwhilers, they did the studies for NEDLAC and came to the conclusion that the job losses would be minimal, if any. Those are the academics. People with good intentions who propose policies that have bad outcomes. Complicit in the adoption of the national minimum wage. They approved it. And as I said, resulted in minimal acceptable increase in unemployment. What is acceptable? One job lost is not acceptable if it's caused by the introduction of some legislation. It's been catastrophic, and it will get worse. Just think about families and unemployment. They're suffering. And add them to the 10 million who are unemployed. Think of the families of the people who are unemployed. Fathers are expected to be breadwinners. There's a horrible story about a father in the Kwakwa area of the Free State. His wife was working, they had 2 children. He lost his job because the business closed down and he couldn't get a job. So he was dependent on his wife. And as far as he was concerned, he was the responsible one. He should be the breadwinner. He couldn't be reliant on his wife. He locked his wife in the house, went outside, drank rat poison, and died a horrible death. Now, that is a really bad story, but there are so many of, just think about it. There are more women who are unemployed in South Africa than men. What do young women do if they can't find jobs? I had one woman come to the office, came and spoke to me about this whole question. And she said she'd lost her job. Couldn't I help her to get a job? So I asked her to tell me her history. She said she'd had a very good job. She lost it, and she made a terrible mistake. She did not want to work for another employer at the same rate, at a lower rate than the one she'd been receiving. She wanted the same salary. She said it took her quite a while to decide that this was a bad idea. And she then started asking for reduced salaries. The first question they would ask her then is, how long have you been without a job? That is apparently the worst thing you can question you could have asked if you're unemployed. She'd been then unemployed for 4 years. So I said to her, well, what do you do? How do you keep going? How do you look after your daughter? She said, I'm ashamed to tell you. You can guess what she'd been driven to doing. There must be tragic stories going on across this country. And you have alcohol and drug abuse, we know it happens. And crime, does it not look to be the only option you have if you've got nothing else and you can't get a job? So the question is, what must happen before we see change? We have been pushing this story for a long time. In 2012, we assisted an organisation of the unemployed, wrote up a petition for them to take to Thabo Mbeki, who was president at the time. They walked from Centre City in Joburg to Pretoria to go and hand over the petition. He received it. He sent it to the Department of Labour. They called them in for meetings and essentially terrified them, and nothing happened. The Jobseeker's exemption certificate is the idea they took to Mbeki, and which didn't receive any favour. Now, what is it? The idea is to exempt the unemployed from the labour laws. Simple. But now they've got to prove it, that they're exempt. Give them an exemption certificate, a job seeker's exemption certificate, as proof of their exemption. Exemption certificates to be valid for at least 2 years so that they can look around for jobs, change jobs. If they end up with a bad employer, they could change their jobs because the exemption certificate would give them an in that they wouldn't have if they were just merely ordinary unemployed. And the most important part, that the holders should be entitled to enter into any employment agreement they wish with any employer under any conditions at any pay they find acceptable, for them to make the decision, nobody else. Just imagine if it worked like that in South Africa. It would change dramatically. If somebody came along to you, you're looking for somebody to work in your garden, and they've got one of these exemption certificates, and you know, okay, I don't have to worry. And if this was happening all over the place, I would expect entrepreneurs to start scratching their heads about how they can put these people to work and make a profit out of it. What I did add as a proviso, that the applicant should be unemployed for 6 months, or should have been unemployed for 6 months or more. The reason, I knew that the unions would object to an exemption certificate being given on the first day of unemployment. So, unemployed people who are unemployed for 6 months or more, and there are many of them. Many of them have been unemployed for a year and more. There should be a written employment agreement stipulating conditions, and this should be obligatory. And what would happen then is that if the inspectors come around to visit an employer, they have a copy of the exemption certificate and they have a copy of the employment agreement, and that covers them against any kind of charges. Very important, remove regulations that burden small business. It's small businesses that employ most people, especially first-time employees. In the European Union, most of these jobs are taken by people who have, I think it's small businesses with less than 10 employees. Most of these jobs go to those people. And I've been trying to find out exactly why they are preferred and why they don't go take their businesses above 10 employees, but there has to be, it will be a regulatory reason. The small businesses are the natural employers of the unemployed. So what we have to do is to open up the labour market at the bottom end of the market by exempting the unemployed from the labour laws and making it easier for small businesses to start. That, as I see it, is the only solution we can find in South Africa. As far as the labour laws are concerned, they're not going to move on them. You can try as you like. You can. One of our friends wanted to have a go at the Labour Relations Act and was told, don't worry, even if it makes a lot of sense, you're not going to get past the judges. They are not going to accept it. So I see the Jobseeker's exemption certificate as the only potential solution that I can think of. And by the way, it won an international prize for being possibly providing a solution to a very serious problem. Thank you.
Comments, questions, debate?
One comment and then
Far right for me.
Sorry?
The far right.
A question, a comment and a question. I mean, for 4 years, not so long ago, I ran an olive farm. And you're right in what you say when it comes into these sort of things. It takes a relationship out of an employer-employee in a pernicious way. Because, for example, you can have an old chap who is a bit past his sell-by date in strong work, and you may keep him on as a cleaner and tidier around the yards and stuff like that. But when you're suddenly told you have to do all these things and stuff, you start to question that and whether you should still keep him. And I think it takes a lot of the humanity out of the employer-employee relationship. Anyway, that's another story. And also, you know, in olives, you can go completely mechanical. You can do that in tree crops around the world, and they do. And that is what is now happening in South Africa. And it's absolute tragedy, you know, that we are going that way in the face of this massive unemployment. But the question I have is slightly unrelated, and that is, you saw the raids on the CBD with foreigners selling, or not just foreigners, people selling, what do they call it, counterfeit goods and stuff like that. Now, I just want you to comment on this, and perhaps you can comment on it also, Leon. you know, is counterfeit goods such a problem? You know, anyone who goes into the CBD and thinks they're buying an original Nike pair of Takis has got to, you know, be a bit loopy, you know. And yet there's a whole economy happening there. Now, there is obviously the argument that you're not paying some sort of import tariff, but maybe comment on that. But you know, there's an economy happening, and suddenly you're going and half destroying it. So I find myself very distressed by that, but I don't quite have I haven't quite got the thought it through. So I wonder if you've done any more thinking through of that. And related to that is also old Alcock, who talks about this carsonomics, and he says that, you know, the unemployment figures aren't as bad if you take the informal sector in. It may not be the preferred source of work, but there is a lot of stuff happening in the informal sector. So those are some things to comment on.
As far as the traders are concerned, you have to start with what makes them. What did you say? What kind of goods are they? Counterfeit. Counterfeit of what? So you know, you go back in the argument. You have to start there. If they are really counterfeit, if the South African government have signed some kind of treaty that they will not allow it, then of course they've got to take steps against it. But I should imagine, looking at that, I would imagine that what they were after really was foreigners, illegal foreigners, and they went after the goods at the same time. But Leon can say more about the traders and what should happen there. It's just terrible when people have no sympathy for people eking out a living and trading on the sidewalks. Leon, what do you?
Yeah, the thing about counterfeit goods is interesting. The question is who's harmed. And you know, many people would say that the owner of the brand, Nike or something. But I'm not sure that that's the correct way to analyze it. The issue is between, in my view, the consumer and the supplier. If the consumer has been defrauded by being told this is a fancy designer label and it's in fact not, then it's between the consumer and the supplier, and I've never heard of that causing a problem. In other words, I'm not aware of any consumers complaining that the product they got for free. The other thing that interests me is Eustace said they're going against foreigners. I wonder about that because last week I went to the China Mall at Bruma, and the area where the street traders were raided, South Africans, in the China Mall there are shelves and shelves and shelves of counterfeit products. So it seems to me the foreigners are actually being left alone. The South Africans are being raided, which is a particular anomaly. Now I don't know that's not a market survey, that's a sample. So, you know, I would say the counterfeit issue is a complex philosophical and legal issue. I don't want to go into it now. But the main issue for me is whether the consumer is defrauded. And if the consumers don't feel defrauded, well, quite what are the rights of the people whose label have been used, and is a philosophical debate that, by the way, for those who don't know, it's one of the only issues that amongst free market and libertarian people in the world, classical liberals, is a bone of contention. There are some who believe that intellectual property rights are a legitimate form of property and ought to be protected like all other property, and some, and I don't know what the numbers are, the ratios, it seems about 50-50 from discussions I've had around the world, some who argue that intellectual property is a phony form of right. It's not really a property right. And intellectual property should be left to the law of contract and not governed by the law of property rights. This is not going to be the forum in which we can explore that much, but if anyone wants to, I'm happy to do so with you.
I can just say this, Leon, that that is not going to go away soon, because according to an article I read, the greatest part of the balance sheets of US companies consist of intellectual property rights and not real assets.
So just one comment on the counterfeit goods. There's actually now an organisation in Pretoria. They've signed agreements with the original companies, and they are actually taking the counterfeit stock, taking off the labels, and reselling them in the market. So they're actually taking those counterfeit goods, taking them, rebranding them in an African brand, and selling them back into the market.
And something's not legitimate.
And then on the other, just one. I don't know if you've looked at in India, Prahalad, well described in bottom of the pyramid, where how the influx of women from rural areas into urban areas, specifically into the garment industry, how that put them on the first leg up in getting their families into education and into better circumstances. And there was actually, they've got very good case studies in India showing that not having a minimum wage, where the employer actually sets the wage, has helped a lot of those women, and that's why India has grown so much, get them out of that rural areas into an urban economy where they can actually pay for education and start their families growing.
It's a good example.
Just what Anthony raised, it wasn't responded to, is the question of the size of the informal sector. If I can just make the brief observation that quite clearly it's big, but we call it the informal sector, and again, this is my area of passion and expertise as opposed to Eustace's. And it actually should be called the criminalized sector, or the illegal sector. The word informal makes it sound sexy. But the fact is that it's the sector, it's the business activity of poor people which has been turned into a crime. Should be called the criminalized sector. And it is big. That's where people earn a living. That's how they survive. That's why we don't see kwashiorkor, why we don't see starvation, why we don't see so much begging, is because the people have resorted to criminal activity to survive. A simple street trader is committing a crime. It's against the law. And a spaza shop is against the law, zoning law, property law, township law, and so on. So it must be understood that all of these people who are 10 million human beings are surviving by being criminals, by being defined in law as criminals. It's actually unconscionable.
And what you do know is that if my proposal is adopted, a lot of that will go away.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to leave it to Eustace.
David Ansara from the Centre for Risk Analysis. Just in terms of the collective bargaining structure that we have in South Africa in terms of wage setting, and it seems that that also acts as a constraint on employment. So if you think of the extension of collective bargaining agreements to non-parties, for example, each sector or industry has their own bargaining council, and small businesses in particular are not capacitated to send representatives to these councils, and therefore have to pay their workers whatever the industry agreed minimums are. I mean, what would your comments be about trying to address that problem and basically allowing small businesses to just set their own wage prices in negotiation with their own workers?
Absolutely. What would be a good idea is to follow the example of New Zealand, who changed countrywide bargaining to firm-based bargaining. And the number of days lost just within 1 year dropped to 1/5 of what it had been before, because it's crazy, actually, this thing for bargaining across the whole country, because the firms are different, the people are different. To be fighting for the same level of wages just does not make any sense at all. It's no wonder we have the problems we have.
I was trying to get an understanding from an economic analysis point of view of what is the effect of minimum wage legislation. If you set a minimum price for the offer of a good or service to the market. And so to break it away from labour, I said, let's choose another product. and I thought, let's choose Boerewors rolls. If we set the minimum price for Boerewors rolls as being 75 Rand, what would that do to the market for Boerewors rolls?
Destroy it.
And I realized that what the effect would be is that the only Boerewors rolls vendors who would be able to survive would be the gourmet Boerewors roll suppliers. And so what this means is that setting a minimum wage gives an unfair advantage to the highly skilled workers and gives a negative advantage or disadvantage to those who are unskilled, to people who would supply a Boerewors roll who's nowhere near worth 75 Rand. I don't know if you find that analysis useful or not.
Yes, that makes sense. And the big thing is that if you look across the board, what happens there, the larger companies, they do not hire the kind of labour we're talking about. And the small ones have great difficulties. So that needs to be disentangled as far as small business is concerned.
Just carrying on this debate of minimum wages, what is interesting is that the fact that Amazon decided to pay above the minimum wage. I see that has been a deliberately competitive strategy to force the minimum wage up, because it meant that retailers who didn't have the other efficiencies that Amazon have would be at a clear disadvantage. And so by doing that, Amazon was able to put an onerous burden on its competitors. This as a
You'd think that their competitors would be able to have the price advantage to be able to compete.
Eustace,
Where?
Chance.
Sorry.
Eustace, your hypothesis that the person or the group that would want to answer that question about would they like a job was obviously the unemployed. But what would the reaction be of the trade unions? Well, they would be the most likely to object because they're unrepresented, or they wouldn't be too happy about that. So who represents the unemployed? Who's going to speak for them? One question.
At the moment, nobody.
Okay, so my question to you is, who's going to speak for them? Then, on the other hand, your idea of the certificates, brilliant idea. So, who represents this vast body, the 70% of people, small businesses, who employ all this vast number of unemployed people? When the South African police or the trade unions start toying out at their doorsteps, throwing rocks through their windows, blah, 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 we know how we carry on in this country. Who's going to represent them? Who's going to go to this government and say, guys, your policies aren't working?
Good question. Difficult to answer.
I would like to suggest, Leon, you often speak in public. You've got to raise your profile, my friend.
Duncan?
Thanks, Eustace. In line with the previous question, I'm very depressed. I feel that this is a meeting of despair, or at least you're leading us to despair. The politician, and you've led a march from Johannesburg CBD to President Mbeki, the politician who passed most of the regulations which are giving us difficulties today, said only about 24 or 36 months ago that if he had known in 2015 what he knew and what he thought he knew in 1995, he would never have passed the regulations. And that politician has held, who dislikes the labour regulations that he passed, has held two of the most important economic portfolios in this country since that day, or these days. And yet, we're going nowhere. You mentioned the do-gooders and people in academia who should have known better. I did a survey of South African economists about 10 years ago in Parwell with a colleague or some colleagues had published earlier in America and in the UK about minimum wages. The profession of economists in America, in the UK, and in South Africa was overwhelmingly against a national minimum wage for the obvious reason. I don't see the profession of economists, I don't see the politicians moving. I think your idea is ingenious. I'd love to see it working. But I don't see us getting out of this until there's some sort of climateric, as we mentioned earlier, in society. I don't see how we're going to get out of it, out of the binary until we have a climateric moment. Would you like to comment on my despair?
I do believe we can change things. Otherwise I wouldn't be standing here. And maybe I haven't been working hard enough. But I do think that the way to deal with the problem is that the unemployed people themselves must start talking. They must start speaking out. And for them to do that, they need the intellectual ammunition. They need to know why it is they are unemployed. And we are in contact with a group at the moment. And we are hoping that they will be able to take that message out to other groups around the country so that we have unemployed people putting their case, and it's a very strong case.
BG. I disagree with you. I don't think we have a problem with unemployment. We have a problem with population growth rates. At the moment, in the real world, South Africa's growth in GDP is effectively zero. And depending on who you want to believe, and that's difficult, population growth has been 2.5% and 3%. So at the moment you have population growth greater than the growth in wealth in the country, you've got a severe problem. We need to concentrate on, and certainly not every child comes out of walking down the aisle in white, but we need to focus on getting young women particularly to understand the importance of effective contraception and to not rely on social handouts. Because until we get the population growth under control, you can do what you like. It's not going to change things. The second point is that a very significant number of the unemployed are unemployable, particularly the young ones. They have got no work ethic, and there's, of course, very many explanations for this, but the simple fact of the matter, as an employer, particularly in manufacturing, you can't look at solving the country's problems while your company goes bust in the meantime. So you try people who work out. If they do, terrific. If they don't, you get rid of them by one means or another. So developing a work ethic, and most importantly, doing something about the growth in population is vital if the unemployment level is to be effectively addressed.
Well, one of the things that you have to bear in mind is that one of the things that a young woman without a job can do is to produce a baby and get a grant from the government. So they are subsidizing that kind of behavior.
I was just going to say, I drove back a couple of years ago and I listened to one of the best politicians on the radio that I ever have heard. He said, this country is very simple. Quite frankly, there is the government who, through BEE, look after their friends at the top and ensure that they become rich again. Then he said we have policies of affirmative action which ensure that a whole group of people who may or may not deserve jobs get jobs. And then finally we have the unions who look after all the unemployed in the country. I'm going to tell you I will be president of this country because I look after the unemployed. Julius Malema.
And what does he do for them? Zero.
He steals.
At the back. Yeah.
Eustace, you obviously can't tax a person who earns 1,000 rands a month. So employing that person isn't going to improve the other crunch issue in South Africa, which is the very narrow tax base. But there has to be, and of course, the thing, a person who earns that little doesn't spend money on he spends money on food mostly. He doesn't spend money on the things that attract VAT. So it's no good in that department. So, but there has to be another point to employing the unemployed, and I wish you would dilate a bit on that, because they're not actually doing anything for the health. To employ the unemployed doesn't actually improve the health of the South African economy.
It will, absolutely.
Massive.
Didn't you see the figure that I put up? If they got 1,000 rand a month each, it turns into millions in a year, well, billions in a year.
That is spent at ShopRite, pays VAT, keeps people
No, but
some
they
dignity.
don't spend things that attract VAT.
They will, don't worry.
They will buy phones, they will buy iPads.
There was somebody over here. Was I?
If they do get 1,000 rand and they spend it, whatever they spend it on is somebody else's income, and that grows the economy. No, that's
And they get a product or a service.
yeah. There's something else which has been I've been doing a bit of research on South Africa's manufacturing policies, and manufacturing is clearly a way to get jobs going. And over 50% of the cost of government subsidies is allocated to the motor industries in South Africa. Over 50% of taxpayers' money allocated to industrial grants is given to the motor industry. The nature of the motor industry is highly capital intensive. A lot of the factories don't employ anybody. It's just they use artificial intelligence and computer systems to control. So the basis of our subsidy system for manufacturing is to move into capital-intensive employment. To me, this is a total misallocation of fiscal policy, and that is a significant contributor to unemployment. If they said rather, instead of subsidizing capital-intensive, we would say, let's give a wage subsidy. Employ people at a lower wage, a firm could employ people below the wage, but the government will give them a 500 rand or 1,000 rand a month top up, so the person could meet a minimum wage requirement if that was a social objective. That way you'd get jobs. So I think a contributing factor to unemployment. By the way, I thought your analysis was brilliant, and I really want to use it elsewhere. But I think our fiscal policy with regard to how we subsidize and support industry is also a significant contributor to unemployment in South Africa.
Yes, the answer is, as far as the unemployed people are concerned, is leave us alone. That should be what they say to government. Leave us alone and leave our employers alone.
Eustace?
Yes. There's somebody there.
I've just about forgotten what I had in mind. But one thing that I just thought of, I've at one stage ran the biggest employment in civil engineering in labour-intensive construction in Soweto. And the workers there wanted to form the unemployed workers' union because the unions were forcing their cost up. And NEDLAC was supporting the unions and not supporting the people who were working. It is an absolute anomaly, and in fact, that process almost is the reason why the expanded public works program is a disaster. The unions are forcing the wage up, whereas people were prepared to work, as you suggest, for what they thought was adequate. And just as an example, 30 years ago when I started this, we used to put a sign up on the gate. A job, 5 rand. Okay? How many people come for the job? If there weren't enough today, tomorrow it was 6 rand, 7 rand. Eventually you got your 500-600 people. They came on their terms. They came because they were prepared to work for that amount. As soon as the unions got involved, that just went out the window. Finished. That was it. NEDLAC got involved, and the whole thing, despite the fact that the Department of Labour accepted the principle that normal labour rules didn't apply. They now apply. So the expanded public work program doesn't work. So just as one last example, when we went and worked in the, people who know, the 3 O's area, northern Namibia, people were prepared to work for 2 rand a day. They had no money, yet they were prepared. They didn't insist on 50, 60, 100 rand. They wanted 2 rand, so they could get 2 rand. And any number of people came to the gate at 2 rand. Now, that just amplifies what you said, that people must be given the choice of working if they want to work, at whatever terms they elect to accept. They cannot get paid more than they can produce, and that is what the unions are forcing them to be. The construction industry cannot work at the rate that the unions are insisting that the labourers get paid, because it's cheaper to use a machine. And so if it's cheaper to use the machine, we used to write into the contract, if the cost of labour becomes more than the cost of the machine, change to a machine. That's it. Sorry, you lose your job. So I'd love to have a sort of one-on-one with you about how that evolved, because that was a massive employment stream that was, let's say, chartered, and it was just rigged by interference.
I'm hoping you're going to write that up for me.
Well, I can write it up. I've written it up many times. Thank
I'd
you.
be much obliged. Yes, sir.
Eustace, with your permission, if I may. Leon, would you, if you would care to, give us your views on Ricardo Hausman's recommendations for the 3rd time to the ANC for his views on how to solve South Africa's unemployment problems. He's just been out here at taxpayers' expense, and the ANC seems not to hear him, but they keep inviting him back.
You wanting a comment on his views?
Yeah, his views.
Response?
Are they practical? Does the ANC just like having him here as a guest? I mean, he's...
No, I think it's, for me, it's a kind of quantum leap to a different context.
But they keep bringing him back to tell us how to solve the problem, but they don't listen to him.
My view is jobs cannot be created and are never created. Jobs exist. So long as there are unsatisfied human wants, there are jobs. So, for example, I have a job for somebody who wants to provide me with a 3 a.m. coffee service. I have to get up and do my own. So there is somebody, are there applicants for the job? I'm happy to offer them the job. They might not like the pay, they might not like it. But nonetheless, so long as there are human beings with needs, there are jobs. The question is, what is stopping somebody who wants to do the job and somebody who wants the job done agreeing to it? That's really, in my view, ultimately always the question. And that has to be almost always legislation. So unless the recommendation is, say, get the legislation away that stops somebody who wants something done and somebody willing to do it, exchanging that, seems to me you will have unemployment. You must have unemployment. It seems to me not rocket science. And so I don't know, the answer is the ANC consults and listens to us too. We get invited to portfolio committees to give evidence, and it follows some advice. Now, at the moment, on minimum wage, it's followed the advice of the WITS academics and UCT academics, and they had, in my view, the completely unconscionable statement, disgusting statement, that the increase in unemployment would not be statistically significant. They said it would be somewhere between 400 and 800,000. Eustace thinks closer to 1 million, but now just think about what they're saying. If you've got 10 million 800,000 more people is not statistically significant. These are human beings you're talking about. So they have reduced human beings to a statistic. So they go to the ANC and they say, if you adopt this law, there won't be a statistically significant increase in unemployment, which is 800,000 human beings rendered destitute. So that's the ANC's response. It's frankly everybody's response. It's the DA and it's the IFP and it's the EFF. There is nobody out there. It happens. I'm having talks with one of the lesser parties that got routed in the last election, and they got beaten up because they tried to out-left the left. They're now talking to me, and I'm saying to them, there's a big void in South African politics. Nobody is talking for the poor. Why don't you become the party for the poor? The rights of the poor to sell, to trade, to goes on, and we're not here. I don't want to take up Eustace's time, but an informal settlement, shack dwellers. They are forbidden by law from improving the quality of their housing. They may not turn their shack into a permanent structure. The law makes improving your living standard a criminal offence if you're poor. Now, in my view, there's a space for a political party that says, we speak for the rights of the poor. We don't care about the rich, we don't care about the employed, we don't care about the unions, we don't care about business associations, we care about destitute poor people, and we want their human right to improve their own living conditions at their own expense, which at the moment is criminalised. I want to make that clear. It is a criminal offence to improve the quality of your tin shack, because it violates town planning laws, building codes, health and safety laws, zoning laws, survey laws, deed registry laws, and so on. I mean, the answer is I don't particularly share his views, and I don't think the ANC is going to respond.
You had your hand up.
Me, she was before me, so.
Oh yeah, I've been very happy with the discussions because, as Leon mentioned, I'm on human rights and I work at a very grassroots level. There's always a solution, because if ever we can concentrate on them, those people at a grassroots level, to even understand the basic law, that's where everything understands. Because when they start going on the streets and they don't even have any idea, it's just about them making a living. But slowly but surely, we can, it's even different approaches. Like, for instance, I've used soccer because I play soccer as it is for racism issue. I will have taken for granted that in the platform like this, I'm meeting with different people from different backgrounds, but they don't have that opportunity within themselves because, literally, they were even picking on white people's do you really even exist? You will take it for granted, but if you go to them, straight to them, you will get all the answers that you're looking for. But slowly but surely, you collaborate with them, you get to the point of view, they get to your point of view, and then you reach an amicable solution.
Thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted to quickly say,
Sorry, there's behind you, and then you, right at the back, he's been wanting to talk for ages.
No, fine.
Apologies. I'm a student at Rhodes in the Eastern Cape in Grahamstown, and 2 years ago, Gillard Isaacs, who was part of the study at WITS, came and gave a talk. I can't quite remember which organisation at Rhodes hosted it, but I brought up the question of job seeker certificates to him. Now, there's a view among the left in South Africa, and I'm not talking about sort of online keyboard warriors, but I'm talking about economists with a PhD from WITS, that being exploited once you get into the workplace is almost worse. It's worse morally than being unemployed. So, look, I don't agree with this view, and I think Leon gave a good description. They use the language like statistically insignificant, which is ridiculous. But I'd like to ask, addressing their concerns, with this high number of unemployed people, and perhaps an environment that's not really conducive to economic growth, is there any danger that people working at the sort of minimum wage level, the lower wage levels, could be open to exploitation, particularly in areas like the rural sector, farm workers and things like that? Is that a danger at all? Is that something we should be worried about?
Well, I think But with most unemployed people, they're looking around desperately for somebody who will exploit them. Just think about that. Rob, you...
Yeah. I was MD of econometrics, and I've just gone through a forecasting exercise at econometrics. It's the most gloomy forecast I think I've ever made over the last 20 years. And it boiled down to the fact that basically we are not creating economic growth, which translates into not creating jobs. And the disappointing thing about it was that you could not identify anything which is going to bring back attractiveness of South Africa in terms of investment. It's only through investment, foreign and local investment by business, that is going to ultimately change the nature of economic growth in this country. Now went deeper than that. I've since had 3 or 4 opportunities to chat to young graduates. I'm talking about black graduates, masters, just coming through masters or whatever it is. And do you know what? Everyone that I've spoken to, of the 4 or 5 groups I've spoken to, have said their first thing is to get a job. They're not jobs for highly qualified people either. Second thing was money. I said, okay, but you're going to get there. What's the third thing? And they all said they're about to emigrate. Now, if you can't make it attractive for overseas companies to come here, and you can't make it attractive that you keep your actually best graduates, what are we doing? What I'm trying to say is that the problems are sitting at a policy level in government as well, whereby you can fiddle around with everything about labour and so on, but if you keep on hammering the question of let's just take expropriation without compensation. I mean, there are about 3 or 4 major issues on the table at the moment, and those are the issues that are actually causing young people and overseas investors, which are so crucial, and local investors, the deepest concerns of the lot. And we've got to get over that.
It is true that one after the other, new policies come out from government, and each one of them seems to be intent on depressing the...
Well, you were having a discussion with me about this just before
Yes.
you spoke, and you're right.
Okay, I think that's it. Neil?
Well, thank you, folks. Thank you, Eustace. Let's thank Eustace in the appropriate way. There's a lot to be spoken about, and I'm puzzled, I'm conflicted about the official data and the high levels of unemployment, which make Eustace enraged, or whatever he said it was, not distressed, compared to the conspicuous fact that people are, in fact, are actually employed in the informal and unrecorded, and what I would think is more appropriately called the criminalized sector. So people have resorted to that. Eustace has got this somewhat ingenious proposal of a job seeker's exemption certificate, and just let me make the observation that what he wants to do is remove the discourse from employers and employees, which, for example, is what happens at bargaining councils, and say, let's forget about them. Let them go to their bargaining councils and do their deals, and turn your attention to the unemployed people. Say, what should their rights be? What should they be allowed to do? And instead of this phony discourse, which is between people who have a job and people who provide jobs, that is something that should not be the issue. And Eustace is saying, let's stop and consider the unemployed and give the unemployed people rights. And that, I think, is a different perspective that Eustace is bringing to the party. Interestingly, we have not yet come across an argument against that idea. There's some people will say, well, then those people will be exploited. And Eustace will say, like Joan Robinson, the British economist, used to say, there's only one thing that's worse than being exploited by a capitalist, which is not being exploited by a capitalist. So thank you, Eustace, and keep up your good work, and I'm proud to have him as a colleague.